Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at Hebrew nouns in our continuing study of biblical languages. We've already noted that Hebrew parts of speech can be divided into three sections. We have the nominals, that's where we're going to find our nouns, our pronouns, our adjectives, those noun descriptors. These things either do or receive the action. Then we have verbs. Coming under verbals, notice we've got regular verbs and infinitives, like we say the act of baptizing, but then the infinitive would just be to baptize. Um, and then a participle, an easy way to remember that's sort of the ing word, um, baptizing, things like that. And they describe the action in all the verbals. And then finally, we have the function words, article, conjunctions, prepositions, adverbs. These are the connecting links. These are the matchmakers that connect nouns to other nouns, nouns to verbs, and so on. Now, again, we already said, so a little bit of review here. In English, we normally say the subject first, then the verb, then the object. We can change that up a bit, especially if you're Yoda in Star Wars. But notice, God created the earth. The man hit the ball, that sort of thing. So you have a noun, a verb, and then another noun, but in this case, it would be what we call the direct object. It's the thing acted upon. Hebrew. In Hebrew, we go in the other direction. First of all, remember, we're writing Hebrew right to left, and normally we start with the verb. So notice in this case, bara Elohim et haaretz. That's he created. You say, who's created? Well, the subject comes next. God is the one who created, in this case, the earth. And notice there is that marker, what we call the direct object marker. That's telling you that's not doing the action, it's receiving the action. It's what was created. So that's the object of the sentence. You won't always have that there, but when it is, look for it, and that's going to tell you that that's not the subject, it's the object of the receives the action of the verb. Now, all nouns have gender. In English, we have masculine, feminine, and neuter. There is no neuter in Hebrew. In Hebrew, everything is either he or she. There is no it. Even if something isn't like a book, how can that have a gender? But it will have a gender in Hebrew. The word sefer will have a gender. All words have some sort of gender, and then all nouns. When I say all words, all nouns, and then all nouns will have a number. In English, we have singular and we have plural. They have those in Hebrew, but actually, there's one more. There's singular, dual, and plural. Dual is like just a pair of something, just two of them. So one, two, or more than two. Now, here's what that looks like, and we're just borrowing in the middle column. The word sus is horse. So the singular would be sus, susim would be the plural, and then the dual. Notice it looks quite a bit alike. Susaim. Uh, and so it looks alike, and it's easy to confuse the dual and the plural, at least in this case. And then, no, that's a feminine noun. I'm sorry, that's a masculine. If we switch over to a feminine, and here we have the Hebrew word Torah. Torah is feminine. That just happens to be that way. That doesn't say anything about the law and that's a womanly thing. No, just the word itself happens to be feminine. Notice that kametz hey ending. That's going to be sort of the hint. And then, so I have Torah, and then if I want to say in the plural, notice Torot would be that oath ending is typical plural in Hebrew, just like the im ending is typical masculine plural. And then Torata im, that's going to be the dual, so it comes across as just a bit different. We're not going to see it used very often in the dual. Dual is usually reserved for things that come in pairs, like I have two eyes and two ears and things like that. So the feminine, notice the nouns referring to the feminine persons or animals will be feminine. And then the nouns ending with a kametz hey ending just like Torah was one of those, will normally be feminine in gender. That doesn't mean that the thing is feminine, it just means the word is feminine. And then nouns ending with a tau will also normally be feminine in gender. These are ways to pick out the feminine. So the kamatz he, the tau, and those things that, which naturally speaking, girls, women, things like that are normally going to be feminine. Also, nouns that refer to parts of the body that exist in pairs, remember we said the dual, those are usually feminine as well. Now, some irregular feminine nouns. And so here is the word ear, city, that's in the middle. Over on the right, we have irim, cities. That's actually a normal, what do you call it? It's a normal masculine ending, plural ending, but it happens to be a feminine word. So sometimes we have the exceptions to the rule. Another exception, an interesting one, is the word father. Av is the word for father. And yet the plural of father is, we say in English father, the plural is fathers. In Hebrew, you say avot. Well, that's normally a feminine ending. But for some reason, the word father has that feminine ending when it is in the plural. It doesn't mean mothers. There's a different word for that. That means fathers. Now, we also have, as I said, dual nouns regularly indicate two of a pair. You have two hands, so yad is the word for hand, and then yadaim is the word for hands. Notice that's dual. That's not plural. I don't have three hands. I have only two. A pair of, and that's I guess a good way to think of it. Think of it as a pair of anything. And so hands, I've got two of them. I don't have three. Some words are always dual in form. You don't actually find them in the singular. So I've given you two examples. First is shamayim. That's the word for heaven, but we usually say heavens plural. You say, well, why is it plural? I don't know, and actually not plural, but dual. Well, maybe it's because I look in one direction and there's the heavens, and I look in the other direction and they're the heavens. So sort of in both directions. Here's another word. Mitzrayim is the Hebrew word for Egypt. It's not what the Egyptians called it. It's what the Jewish people called it, and it's what the Bible calls it. Mitzrayim, and the im is this time. It's normally when you hear im is plural, but aim is dual, and so why is Egypt in the dual? Maybe it's been suggested because there's an upper and a lower Egypt. There's a Egypt by the delta, and that's lower Egypt. There's as you go upstream, that's the rest of Egypt, and so there's always two parts of Egypt. So maybe for that reason, it's described in the dual. Another term that's always used in the dual, ma'im. You can't say it singular. It doesn't really mean anything. Ma'im is the word for water. So it's because how can you get one water? Even if you have a drop, you can subdivide that, you can squish it, and it becomes just moisture. So perhaps that's the idea. It's sort of slippery and hard to pick just one part of that water. Now, we also have some irregular stem changes. For the word for man is ish in Hebrew. The word for woman is isha. Now think about that. Ish, that's a man. Isha, that's soft and gentle and just sounds womanly. And that's probably pretty easy to remember. The plural of ish, though, you'd think, well, wouldn't it be ishim or something like that? No, actually, just like the plural of child is not childs, but it's children. Same thing happens here. The plural of ish is anashim. That's for men. And then the plural of isha is similar, but notice it drops that aleph. So nashim is the plural for woman. So you have isha and nashim. That's a woman and women. All right, some types of plurals then. The numeric plural is the most common. The reason you have a plural is because there's more than one thing. And it might be two, but usually it's more than that. If it comes in a pair, then you're going to describe it in the dual. But if it's just more than one, so not necessarily just three or more, it could still be two, but it doesn't have that pair sequence, um, then I'm going to describe it in the plural. And that's the most common use. But there's also what's called the honorific plural, sometimes known as the plural of majesty. When you want to describe something that is majestic, or give it some sort of honorific. Here's an example of this: Isaiah chapter 1 and verse 3. An ox knows its owner, and a donkey its master's manger. And notice the phrase there, its master's manger. The term master, by the way, notice in the English, with the apostrophe, we made that master singular. But the Hebrew, Baalon, Baal is just the word for master or Lord. Remember how there's the pagan god Baal, but that term can be used of any master or Lord. It can even be used of God. It can be used of a husband. Um, but notice it was translated here as a singular, even though it is plural, and the plural is seen in that yod there. And then the new. I'm sorry, not the new. That's a vav at the end, and at the end there, that's letting you know it belongs to the donkey. We haven't gotten into that yet, so don't worry about that. But the point is, this is a honorific described of this, not a bunch of masters, because the donkey doesn't have a whole bunch of masters. It has one master. Um, and so this is a honorific use. Now, that honorific sometimes is used in a different way, in a very common way in the Old Testament, and that's in the word Elohim, which is the word for God. Normally, when it's now, Elohim can be used for a bunch of pagan gods, the false gods. It can be used in that way. It can be used of judges and things like that. But normally, it's used of the God of the Bible, and that's a plural ending, but it always comes with a singular verb, which means that we're to understand it in the singular, not in the plural. Some people have wondered, gee, is that a reference to the Trinity? I don't think it is. I hold to the doctrine of the Trinity, but I don't think that's where we get our evidence from. And the New Testament never points to that as the reason why you hold to that idea. It never says, see, the Hebrew word Elohim is plural. The New Testament doesn't ever mention that. And so I don't think that's a good argument to use. I don't think it's a valid argument to use. And then there's also the abstract plural, which conveys an abstract idea. Here's one of those, Jeremiah chapter 3 and verse 4. Have you not just now called to me, my father? You are the friend of my, and literally says, of my youths. Well, that's sort of an abstract idea. And notice it put it in the plural, even though he's only got one youth. The person being described, he doesn't have multiple lifespans in the past where he had multiple youths. No, it's describing his youth as sort of an abstract idea, and so that's the use of the plural. But most plurals are going to be just numeric plurals in the same way it is in English. Now, let me talk just a bit about synonyms. A synonym is one of a group of words that share the same basic meaning, but with completely different spellings and sounds. For example, you might have a baby and an infant, and they basically mean the same thing, but they're spelled differently, they sound differently, they're synonymous, the terms are synonymous with each other. A student and a pupil. Now the word pupil can be used in a few different areas. It can be used like the pupil of your eye instead of like the student's sort of pupil. But these words are still synonyms. A smart and intelligent. Now you might argue about shades of meaning, and you can argue about shades of meaning when speaking of synonyms. Both English and Hebrew have quite a number of synonyms, and sometimes there are shades of differences between the two. More often, it's just a word choice. If you use the term baby and if you use the term infant and you're talking about like an infant, a baby, then you're probably just going to pick one, whichever one and you don't have some hidden meaning because you chose one over the other. And sometimes you might use both, especially in a sort of poetry. You might use both, again, not to say something different, but just to be poetic and to say the same thing with different words. And the Psalms are going to do that a lot. Now, what are the different Hebrew words that are translated man? And are there ways, in what ways are they distinctive, or is there a difference between the two? So here I put three different words. Ish, we already mentioned, this word for man. Adam is also the word for man. And Enosh is the word for man. All three of these can be used interchangeably, although there might be a nuance. For example, ish, remember, the feminine form is isha. So ish is actually sort of man, but masculine. Now, it's not always pointing that out when it's used. So whenever you see ish, you don't have to say, well, that's masculine as opposed to feminine. It can be given the context. So you can look at it for the context. But just because ish is there, that doesn't mean you can't take it in sort of a generic human sort of idea. Adam, on the other hand, tends to give itself a little bit better to that sort of, and probably Enosh as well, to that more generic sort of idea. But again, not necessarily. The context can just refer to a specific man. In fact, the first man ends up being called not just by what he was an Adam, he was a man, but also that becomes his name. And so the name, Adam was actually what he was, but it also became the name of that individual. Now, a homonym is one of a group of words that share the same spelling, or maybe it's not the same spelling, maybe it's the same pronunciation, but it could be both, but they have totally different meanings. For example, we can talk about the trunk of a tree, or the trunk of the back of a car, or the proboscis of an elephant, the trunk of an elephant, or swimming trunks. And all of those have different ideas, different meanings, but they're spelled the same way and they sound the same way. You really can't tell the difference outside of the context. Here are not two words, but three. Two, the number two, and then two with double O. That means I'm going to add this to. I'm going to add this also, or just the word to, the locative. I'm going to that place, and they are pronounced identically. They have totally separate meanings, and they are also spelled differently. But they still would be homonyms. Now, here's an example of a homonym. Um, Genesis chapter 2, and notice these are both within a verse of each other, which makes them right next to each other, and that might not be by accident. So Genesis chapter 2, verse 25, we've just seen the creation of the man and the woman. And the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed. And then we turn the verse to chapter 3 and verse 1. Now the serpent was more crafty than any beast of the field which the Lord God had made. And notice, I don't see a similar sounding word in English, but when I look in Hebrew, I see that arom is both the word for naked. They were both arom, they were both naked. But also, I turn to the next verse. Now, the serpent was more arom, he was more crafty than any beast of the field which the Lord God had made. And it's not that one has translated it wrong and the other's translated it right. They are both correct translations. They are both possible, and I think correct. I think the translators did a great job. But it just so happens that the word for naked and the word for crafty they sound alike in Hebrew. So you've got one word that has two totally different and unrelated meanings. And maybe their use, their close proximity, the way they are juxtapositioned, where both the man and the woman and also the serpent are described by that adjective, maybe that was a choice that was deliberate to show a contrast, sort of an interesting contrast, to say two different things, but using the same word as we contrast the condition of the man and the wife and the situation of the serpent. Now, next I want to point out what we call the interrogative he. The Hebrew has no question mark, but a question can be noted by a hataf patak. That is, I notice I've got the mark underneath, and then the aleph for my hataf patak, and so I can, I can't do this with any letter, just with the aleph. It will be at the beginning of the word, or not necessarily the sentence, but the section where the question begins. So here we have this example, ha in hashumar, and notice it's the word for keeper, but it has that sort of question in the beginning. Um, ahi, my brother's keeper, ani. I'm sorry, Anoki. So it's asking, am I my brother's keeper? But you can tell it's a question by that hataf patak in the beginning. All right. Next, we look at, and we'll close on this note, the word, and if we just read it the way it's written, we might go Yahweh. Normally, if we're trying to be very specific, we'll render this Yahweh. And the term seems to be explained, I think, in Exodus chapter 3 and verse 14, where God is meeting with Moses, and Moses has said, you can't send me back to Egypt to represent you. I don't even know what your name is. And God said unto Moses, I am that I am. And he said, thus you shall say to the sons of Israel, I am sent me unto you. Now, the Hebrew there, notice it's not identical, but there are some similarities. It sort of sounds a little bit like, as it says, Yaheh, Asher, Aheh. And so it sounds a little bit like this, what's sometimes described as Yahweh. You say, well, where do we get Yahweh from? First of all, the way we pronounce it is actually borrowed. This isn't my slide. I borrowed this from someone, I forget whom. But notice I put the term Yahweh here up in the upper right. And it's been noted that the vowel points are somewhat borrowed from the vowel points for the Hebrew word Adonai, which is the Hebrew word for Lord. And so that pronunciation, Yahweh, is that the way they said it? Well, maybe it was. Yeah, at least that's become sort of a way to teach it. But if you go to certain schools, for example, if you go to old Germany or look in some very old translations, instead of Yahweh, you'll see Jehovah. Well, where does that come from? Well, first of all, that's the J sound is anglicized. So whenever you see that J sound in either Old or New Testament, in either Greek or in Hebrew, that's always an anglicized one. Neither Greek nor Hebrew actually has the letter J, but sometimes they will take either the I in Greek, or the iota in Greek, or the yod in Hebrew, and transliterate that into sort of a J sound, so that when you hear words like Jerusalem or James or Jacob or Joseph, none of those are all anglicized forms of those names. Instead of James, it's going to be Jacob. Even in the New Testament, if you look at the Greek, Jacob is the rendition for James. And so notice they've done the same thing here down in the bottom right, where you see Yehovah, and then they're borrowing the vowel points from the word Elohim. Well, some of them at least. Yeah, it's not an identical sort of thing. So I'm going to try to be consistent. Sometimes I'll probably slip, but when I see what we call the tetragrammaton, these 4 letters that make up the name of the Lord, I'm going to, as a general rule, follow the Jewish practice, and I'm going to pronounce that Adonai. which is the Hebrew word for Lord. You say, well, why are you doing that? I'm doing that because that was a practice that goes all the way back to the writing of the New Testament and even earlier, as early as the Septuagint. So that was 200, 250 BC. The Jewish scribes took it, and as they were translated from Hebrew into Greek, instead of trying to transliterate the name of God, which they could have done, but instead they just put the Greek word for Lord. Now in Greek you say kurios. That's the Greek word for Lord. I'll stick to the Hebrew, and most Jewish people today, if they're speaking about, if they want to reference His name, they might not even say this. They might just say the name, the way you say that in Hebrew is Hashem, uh, or they might say Adonai, and that's what I'm generally going to do. So when you hear me reading it that way, I'm just trying to be respectful.